River of Doubt, Part 2, Into the Wilderness, Chapter 6, Beyond the Frontier. On the morning of December 12, 1913, Colonel Candido Rondon, 5 feet 3 inches tall, with dark skin, a shock of black, slightly graying hair, and a ramrod straight posture, was looking crisp and starched in his dress whites as he anxiously paced the deck of the Nioac, a shallow river steamer that was anchored at the juncture of the Paraguay and Apa rivers on Brazil's southern border. Peering into the distance, Rondon searched for a column of smoke, a tall steel mast, anything that would herald the arrival of the Adolfo Riquelme, the Paraguayan president's gunboat yacht that was carrying Theodore Roosevelt to meet him. After almost 2 months in South America, Roosevelt had finally completed his official duties and could now devote himself entirely to his long-anticipated expedition into the Amazon. So remote was the region he had agreed to explore, however, that even getting to the River of Doubt would require a journey of at least 2 more months, first by boat and then on muleback. Crossing into Brazil on the broad Paraguay River, Roosevelt and his men would continue upstream as far as possible, disembarking at a telegraph station and frontier town called Tapirapoan. They would then make their way across 400 miles of the Brazilian highlands, passing through open plains, scrub forests, barren desert, and dense jungle to reach the river and launch their boats down its black, fast-moving waters. With every mile of this journey, the expedition would be moving further from populated areas and closer to the edge of the unknown. Although the initial leg of boat travel offered a last opportunity for relative comfort and safety, the grueling overland journey would take them well past the frontier of settled lands and into dangerous wilderness regions where the first outposts of military and governmental authority had only recently been established, and where harsh terrain and fierce indigenous tribes still posed a grave threat to intruders. Even for the most hardened, ambitious Brazilian frontiersmen, the territory that Roosevelt was preparing to cross was considered too difficult and dangerous to settle or explore. Indeed, except for indigenous tribesmen, only a handful of men in the history of Brazil had ever reached the headwaters of the River of Doubt and survived to tell the tale. Those men had been led by Candido Rondon. Born in the remote western Brazilian state of Mato Grosso, in a little town called Mimoso that was 20 miles south of the state's capital, Cuiabá, Rondon had grown up in painful isolation from the rest of Brazil. His earliest memories were of war and irreparable loss. His father, Candido Mariano da Silva, a caboclo, or man of mixed Indian and European descent, died from smallpox 6 months before his son was born. Just days later, the Paraguayan dictator Francisco Solano Lopez invaded Mato Grosso in retaliation for Brazil's military intervention in the Uruguayan Civil War. Since there were no lines of communication at that time between Mato Grosso and the Brazilian capital, the remote, impoverished people of Mato Grosso could not look to the government for aid. The War of the Triple Alliance, a bloody 5-year war that pitted Paraguay against an alliance of Brazil, Uruguay, run by a puppet government controlled by Brazil, and Argentina, officially began in 1865, the year that Rondon was born. Under constant siege, the people living in Mato Grosso's far-flung towns fled to Cuiabá in search of protection. Rondon's mother, who was 1/4 Tarina Indian and 1/4 Bororo Indian, snatched up her infant son and ran. All she found in Cuiabá, however, was the same deadly disease that had killed her husband. In 1867, half the refugees in Cuiabá, roughly 6,000 people, died from smallpox. In the midst of famine, widespread disease, and war, Rondon survived. His mother did not. Survival against great odds was to become a hallmark of Rondon's life, but so too were loneliness and isolation. Orphaned at the age of 2, Rondon was cared for by his grandparents until they too died while he was still a boy. He was then sent to live with his mother's brother, a man who adopted him, gave him his surname, and educated him until, at the age of 16, Rondon moved to Rio de Janeiro. The city must have seemed utterly alien to a young man who had grown up in the backwoods of Mato Grosso. It is no surprise that he gravitated towards the only semblance of a family that was available to him, the Escola Militar, Rio's military school. Rondon, however, was not like the other boys at the military school, and nearly a year passed before he began to feel comfortable there. Even as a teenager, Rondon was serious and driven. He was also poor beyond anyone's understanding. He woke up at 4 a.m. every day to swim in the sea and was back in his dark room by 5 a.m., studying by the thin light of a whale oil lamp, while the other students, most of whom had been out late the night before, burrowed deeper into their beds, dreading the 6 a.m. reveille. Besides his extraordinary discipline, Rondon's extreme poverty and rural background made him an outcast. Too poor even to afford textbooks, he never left campus with the other boys on the weekends, and he was nicknamed the Hairy Brute because he was so awkward in social situations. The earnest young man's isolation was so complete that no one around him noticed that he was starving. Living on a meager diet of rice and beans and working night and day in an effort to complete a 2-year degree in only 1 year, he became so malnourished that he finally collapsed while descending a flight of stairs on his way to a math class. Rondon lost an entire year of school while he slowly recovered, but he spent the time tutoring other students and never gave up his ambitions for a military career. After returning to school, he earned a bachelor's degree in mathematics and the physical and natural sciences, and while still in his early 20s was promoted to military engineer, a title that ensured him a lifelong professorship or a well-respected position as an intellectual at the military headquarters in Rio. Positions that would have been the culmination of a dream for many men, especially a poor caboclo from remote Mato Grosso. Rondon, however, had other plans. He wanted to serve not just his country, but its most disenfranchised and endangered inhabitants, the Indians. I want to bring the civilization which I have acquired to my Mato Grosso and my Amazonia, he said, to the jungle and its tribes. His determination to protect South American Indians and incorporate them into mainstream Brazilian society, a passion that would come to override all others in his life, grew less out of his ethnic background than his philosophical convictions. Rondon was a member of Brazil's positivist movement, which, founded by the French philosopher Auguste Comte in the mid-19th century, had its foundations in the French Enlightenment and British empiricism. Although positivists claimed to be, as one historian put it, the respectful heirs of Catholicism, the country's dominant faith, their beliefs were in direct contradiction to that religion. Largely a philosophy of humanity, positivism chose scientific knowledge and observed facts over mysticism and blind faith, putting its trust in the inevitable pull of progress, a type of Darwinian evolution towards civilization. Rondon was first exposed to the tenets of positivism while he was a student at the military school. His math teacher, Benjamin Constant, a man known as a mathematical sleepwalker because he could sit for hours in perfect silence ruminating on the mysteries of math while the chaotic world went on around him, was a vocal member of the movement and did not hesitate to indoctrinate his students. Although he was a personal friend of Emperor Pedro II, Constant, through the military, played a pivotal role in the overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of the Federal Republic of Brazil in November of 1889. After the relatively bloodless coup, Pedro II, like countless fallen monarchs before and after him, sought exile in Paris. The leaders of the Republic created a new flag for Brazil, choosing a green background with a bright blue globe resting on a gold diamond. On the globe, they scattered 27 five-pointed stars, one for each of Brazil's states, and for the federal district, and stretched a white banner across its face that today still proudly bears the positivist motto, Ordem e Progresso, order and progress, not just for Brazilians, but also for the country's native inhabitants. Less than 6 months after the founding of the Republic, Rondon was given an unexpected opportunity to put his positivist beliefs to work for the good of Amazonian Indians. He was chosen as the head of the Strategic Telegraph Commission, thereafter known as the Rondon Commission, a job that would put him in direct contact with the Amazon's most isolated tribes. Rondon accepted the assignment and returned to Mato Grosso in April of 1890 as a local hero. He was not yet 25 years old, but just 8 years after leaving Cuiabá, he was the commander of a small arm of the military, and he had been entrusted with arguably the Republic's most difficult assignment. The Rondon Commission's expeditions into the Brazilian interior were infamous. At best, they were long, exhausting, lonely treks through unfamiliar territory. At worst, they were terrifying forced marches that subjected the soldiers to disease, starvation, and relentless Indian attacks. Rondon was supposed to have between 100 and 150 men for his expeditions, but he rarely had a full unit. In 1900, Rondon began an expedition with 81 men. By the end of the year, only 30 were left. Of the missing, 17 had deserted, and the rest were either hospitalized or dead. Time passed, and Rondon gained more experience, but the conditions under which his men labored did not improve. In 1903, only 55 men returned from an expedition that had begun with 100. Assignment to Rondon's unit became a punishment, reserved for those enlisted men who had proved themselves to be lazy, violent, or frequently both. Many of his men were recruited directly from Rio de Janeiro's prisons. Had they known what hardship they would face on one of Rondon's expeditions, most of them would have likely begged to remain in jail. The most harrowing trip that Rondon's men had endured was in 1909, the year that their commander discovered the River of Doubt. He had started out in early June of that year from Tapirapoan, the same town that would serve as the launching point for Roosevelt's overland journey, with 42 men, including 2 Indian guides. A supply train of 500 oxen and 160 mules was supposed to meet him at the next telegraph station, Warana, but only 40 animals survived the journey. A few days later, the expedition's geologist and its pharmacists, as well as several military recruits and civilian workers, had to be sent back because they were too sick to travel any farther. Rondon himself was so ill with malaria that the expedition's doctor finally convinced him to ride on an ox. After riding just a quarter of a mile, however, he insisted on walking with his men, explaining later that with every step, my self-respect was reduced a little more. In early August, the men, struggling through a dense, tangled jungle that Rondon described as monstrously fecund, is producing or capable of producing an abundance of offspring or new growth, fertile, stumbled upon a strange, twisting stream. In some places, the stream plunged underground. In others, it spread out to nearly 40 feet in width. It seemed to flow in a general north-northwest direction, but it twisted so wildly that it was impossible to be sure where it would lead. After following it briefly, the men, their provisions perilously low, gave up. They had neither the strength nor the time to solve the mystery of the river, prompting Rondon to christen it Rio da Duvida, the River of Doubt. As the men hacked their way through the deepening jungle, their suffering began in full force. By late August, they had exhausted all their supplies and were surviving on Brazil nuts, hearts of palm, wild honey, and an occasional fish. The rivers teemed with piranha, but they sliced through the men's fishing line and hooks with knife-blade teeth. So difficult were they to catch that out of desperation, one lieutenant, a man named Perennis, finally threw dynamite into a pond above a waterfall. As he splashed through the water below, eagerly gathering his spoils, he made the mistake of holding a piranha in his mouth while his hands were busy scooping up others. The fish had at first been stunned by the dynamite and so lay slack between his teeth, but as soon as it recovered, it attacked. Before Perennis had time to react, the piranha had taken a bite out of his tongue. He would have bled to death had the expedition's doctor not staunched the wound with moss. By the time the expedition emerged from the jungle in late December 1909, the men who were still alive were so weak that many of them could hardly crawl. All of them had parasitic insects wriggling under their skin. Those who were not completely naked were wearing only rags, and all were on the brink of starvation. However, over the course of 237 days, they had covered 600 miles of unmapped territory, and Rondon took great satisfaction in the tremendous leap forward that he and his men had made towards the understanding of Brazil's mysterious interior. Then he set about planning his next expedition. Rondon was not, as he later put it, tormented with nervousness when at 11:30 a.m. the Adolfo Requiem finally pulled up alongside the Nioac, and he and his officers stepped aboard the yacht to meet Roosevelt. Although Rondon had spent the better part of the past 25 years in the jungle, frequenting the ministries of the Bororo, Parichi, and Nambiquara Indians, perfecting the etiquette of their respective courts, he was confident that he would know how to greet a former president of the United States. If, when we greet in the Bororo fashion, we are immediately prepared for the sharp odor of naked bodies painted with uricum, he wrote, referring to the pungent red pigment used by Amazon tribes. In conversation, when we exchange amiabilities in the language of Corneille and Molière, we are insensibly drawn to gentleness and refinement. In fact, the language of Corneille and Molière was the only language that Rondon and Roosevelt, now officially co-commanders of the expedition, had in common. Roosevelt had learned only 2 words of Portuguese, maconja, which means more soup. And Rondon, although he knew 10 different Indian dialects, did not speak English. Unless Kermit was around to translate, the 2 men had to rely on French, a language that Roosevelt admitted to speaking as if it were a non-Aryan tongue, having neither gender nor tense. Despite this barrier, the 2 colonels seemed to have little difficulty communicating, and by the time their combined party reached the Brazilian River town of Corumba on December 15th, they had already developed a deep and lasting respect for each other. For Roosevelt, Rondon represented the kind of man he had championed and admired throughout his life. A disciplined officer who thrived on physical challenges and hardship and accomplished great feats through sheer force of will. It would be a measure of his profound respect for Rondon that years later Roosevelt would count the Brazilian officer among the 4 greatest explorers of his time, alongside Roald Amundsen, Richard Byrd, and Robert Peary. A conspicuous contrast between the 2 men was in the philosophical conclusions that each drew from his experiences. For Roosevelt, the lessons of nature and human history proved the need to vindicate principles with assertive action, even when that action entailed bloodshed or conflict. Along with that passionate belief in action came a politician's pragmatism, a flexibility in tactics that favored results over process. For Rondon, however, a life spent at the edge of Brazil's frontier and at the margins of its society had instilled a powerful mistrust of imposed solutions and a determination to respect the workings of law and rationality, even when none appeared to exist. In keeping with his positivist beliefs, Rondon did not welcome conflict, but rather sought to avoid it at all costs. Although a military officer, Rondon approached his duties with a pacifist idealism that would ultimately secure him a place not merely as Brazil's greatest explorer, but as one of its pioneering social thinkers. Devotion to their principles would become part of the legend of both Roosevelt and Rondon. Both had developed their beliefs over a lifetime of experience and thought, and both would be remembered for the passion with which they put those beliefs into practice. From the very beginning, however, their contrasting approaches and personalities ensured that the newly renamed Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition would reflect its leaders' powerful and divergent views about life and leadership. The beliefs of both men, moreover, would soon be put to the test on the River of Doubt. Corumba, the town in which Miller, Cherry, Fiala, and Sig had been waiting for Roosevelt for 3 weeks, was larger than most along the Paraguay River. Cherry had been impressed by his first glimpse of the town, seeing it bathed in the early morning sunshine, the red tiled roofs and white walls in pleasing contrast to the rich green of banana trees and the fronds of waving palms. It had not taken long, however, for the romance to wear thin. Although Corumba, which had been founded as a military outpost in 1778, had 10,000 citizens, it did not have streetcars or even hireable carriages. For ambulance service, Cherry noted, a hammock was swung from a long pole that was borne on the shoulders of a couple of porters. After a side trip to a nearby ranch where Roosevelt hunted jaguars, the Nyoac left Corumba on Christmas Day, 1913. It was a brilliantly clear day, Roosevelt wrote. We sat on the forward deck, admiring the trees on the brink of the sheer river banks, the lush, rank grass of the marshes, and the many water birds. The two pilots, one black and one white, stood at the wheel. Colonel Rondon read Thomas A. Kempis. Kermit, Cherry, and Miller squatted outside the railing on the deck over one paddle wheel and put the final touches on the jaguar skins. Fiala satisfied himself with that the boxes and bags were in place. It was probable that hardship lay in the future, but that the day was our own, and the day was pleasant. Rondon had gone to great lengths to try to manufacture Christmas cheer, even sending his men to gather palm leaves and other greenery along the shore so that they could decorate the boat. His American guests, however, could not help feeling homesick. What a Christmas Eve, Cherry had written in his diary the night before. Could anything be less Christmas-like? How I wish I might be at home tonight. Kermit confessed in a letter to Belle that he was not feeling a bit Christmassy either. He missed her, he missed civilization, and he was worried about his father, who he feared had gotten in over his head, a situation for which he blamed Father Zahm. The priest is a foolish, well-meaning little fellow who misled Father greatly as to the conditions of travel and life down here, he wrote. He had never been off the beaten track and saw everything through a golden haze. The Nyoac chugged along at a sluggish pace, leaving the men little choice but to settle back on the side-wheel steamer, jammed tight with men, dogs, crates, and reeking animal skins, and spend the next few weeks getting to know the land and one another. Everyone aboard the Nyoac, with the exception of Kermit, was understandably curious about Roosevelt. He had already surprised them by being warm and affable, more interested in hearing about their achievements and ambitions than in talking about his own. But they, like the men who had planned Roosevelt's speaking tour, knew his reputation for physical vigor and must have wondered if now, at the age of 55, he could still live up to it. It was not long before they had their answer. Not only could Roosevelt withstand extreme tests of physical endurance, but he relished them, to the distress of anyone who was unfortunate enough to be along for the ride. In the White House, Roosevelt used to torture the members of his cabinet with long point-to-point walks through Rock Creek Park, the enormous forested park that runs through Washington, D.C. The walks went on any time of day or night and in any season. On several occasions, we thus swam Rock Creek in the early spring when the ice was floating thick upon it, Roosevelt remembered. If we swam the Potomac, we usually took off our clothes. I remember on one such occasion when the French ambassador Jules Jusserand was along, and just as we were about to get into swim, somebody said, Mr. Ambassador, you haven't taken off your gloves," to which he promptly responded, "I think I will leave them on. We might meet ladies." 5 years after leaving the White House, Roosevelt still had the endurance of a man half his age, and he proved it on New Year's Day, 1914. After a 5 a.m. breakfast of sardines, ham, coffee, and hardtack, Roosevelt, Kermit, some Brazilian officers, and a handful of camaradas, the Portuguese word for comrades and the name given to poor laborers in Brazil, headed out for a jaguar hunt near the banks of the São Lourenço, a small river that the Nyoac had steamed into the day before. This was Roosevelt's second jaguar hunt, but it would later become emblematic amongst the Brazilians aboard the Nyoac as the true measure of the former American president. Anthony Fiala, who witnessed the hunting party's mounting exhaustion from the expedition's base camp along the river, would never forget that day. He later told a reporter for the New York Times, "We did not hear from the party until late in the afternoon, when a big Indian came running into camp shouting, 'Guru, Guru, Haru,' which means plenty work, tired. He fell down in a corner and went to sleep. 20 minutes later, another Indian ran in, apparently all used up. He said, 'Guru, Haru,' and he went to sleep. The third Indian arrived then and said, 'Haru,' as he threw up his arms and went off into a trance. This caused me to become anxious about the safety of the colonel and his son, and we started to look for them as it was getting towards sundown. After walking through the forest for a short distance, we came to a small open space where we found one of the Brazilian officers lying on the ground, so dead tired that he could go no farther. His clothes were torn, and his face and neck were covered with dust and blood. Leaving him in the care of 3 of the natives to carry him back to the camp, I pushed on farther, and in another clearing I saw Colonel Roosevelt and Kermit dragging the other Brazilian officer after them through the jungle. I shall never forget the awesome appearance of the intrepid colonel as the falling rays of the sun streamed through the trees and lit up his dusty and begrimed features. His clothes were torn to tatters, and Kermit was in the same condition, but had not his father's warlike look. I called out to him, "Are you all right, Colonel?" And he replied, "I'm bully," and then went to camp with the used up officer. Next day, the colonel and Kermit were about the camp as if nothing had happened out of the ordinary, but the Brazilians were laid up for 2 days. The Indians regarded the colonel with awe after that trip.